I'm going to be talking this morning largely about the thought of one of those partners of Ronald Reagan's, and that is Pope John Paul II. I want to share some thoughts of my own about faith and reason. I'm going to be drawing heavily on Pope John Paul II's thought about that question. Karol Wojtyła was a philosophy professor, and he published an encyclical letter as Pope John Paul II titled Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. At one level, that encyclical is a kind of celebration of the dignity and importance of philosophy and an exhortation to philosophers of all the various philosophical traditions to think big. And so the late pontiff denied the self-sufficiency of faith. That is, denied that faith can be what it needs to be by itself, apart from philosophy, apart from reason. Quoting St. Augustine, John Paul II said, "If faith does not think, it is nothing." Indeed, faith itself points to the indispensable role of reason and thus of philosophy. In the light of faith, the Pope said, I cannot but encourage philosophers, be they Christian or not, to trust the power of human reason and not to set goals that are too modest in their philosophizing. And while he stressed the role and profound importance of philosophy in the theological enterprise, he also insisted on the autonomy of philosophy as a scholarly and intellectual discipline. That is, he insisted on the importance and dignity of philosophy in its own right, and not merely as the handmaiden of theology or of religion. It would be a mistake, however, to read Fides et Ratio as fundamentally a philosophy professor's celebration or even defense of the importance and autonomy of his beloved discipline. John Paul II was not writing as Karol Wojtyła, the philosopher. He did a lot of writing as Karol Wojtyła, the philosopher, including a very important philosophical book called The Acting Person. But in this encyclical, he was, of course, writing as Pope, as Peter, who Catholics regard as the rock on which Christ builds his church. As Pope, he was addressing the problems in the Christian church that impede the successful prosecution of the church's divine mission. He was concerned to promote a greater, better, richer understanding of the relationship between theology and philosophy, between faith and reason, not primarily for the sake of solving what is admittedly an intriguing intellectual problem, but rather because, as he viewed the matter, the salvation of souls was at stake. The prosecution of the church's evangelical mission was at stake. He was moved to reflect on the relationship between faith and reason precisely with a view to renewing the intellectual life and thus the spiritual life of Christianity for the sake of the Christian church's saving mission. Now, please don't misunderstand me here. The encyclical does not suggest that anyone is going to hell for the sin of holding an incorrect understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. It does suggest, however, that the widespread misunderstanding of this relationship, particularly among those primarily responsible for teaching and evangelization within the church, weakens the ability of Christian evangelists, including ministers and priests and popes and bishops, the ability to transmit the Christian faith. Indeed, the faith that Christians attempt to transmit when they badly misunderstand the relationship between faith and reason is Christian faith only in a weak and defective sense. It may be, for example, an overly rationalistic faith or an overly emotional one. The Jesus in whom people are invited to have faith may be not the Christ of the Gospels, the Word made flesh who suffers and dies for our sins and whose resurrection makes possible our own salvation, but rather a magician or a sympathetic friend or a mere example of ethically upright living, or some such. And of course, there have been theologies in which Christ is presented as all of those things over the course of history.